AI systems are becoming more powerful and more widely used, from workplaces and education to healthcare and government services. But as these technologies become part of everyday life, questions about safety, accountability, and trust become increasingly urgent. What risks should we be paying attention to? And how do we keep up with assessing those risks when the technology is evolving so fast? Also important is who gets to define which risks are high priority and who should be responsible for ensuring that AI systems are developed and used safely. Is it the job of AI firms themselves? Is it the job of government? What kind of control should governments have over AI firms when these risks are identified? I'm Jake Goldenfein. This is the ADM+S Automated Societies podcast, and I'm joining you today from NARM, Melbourne. In this episode, we're exploring the complex and evolving debate around AI safety. We're joined by Kimberlee, Weatherall, and Henry Fraser to discuss what we mean by AI safety, how we should approach emerging AI risks, and the role of research, governance, and policy in shaping the future of AI in Australia and globally. Dr. Henry Fraser is an associate investigator at ADM+S and a lecturer at QUT Law School. Henry's research examines the regulation of AI, focusing on the pressing challenge of distributing risk, responsibility, and liability fairly and effectively across complex digital supply chains. His work has been influential in AI policy and regulation in Australia, Europe, and the United States. Professor Kimberlee Weatherall is a chief investigator at ADM+S and a professor of law at the University of Sydney. Kim specialises in the relationship between law and technology and intellectual property. She was also co-organiser of the AI Safety Forum held at the University of Sydney this month and gave a keynote address on the state of AI policy. Henry also presented at that AI Safety Forum on responsibility across the AI value chain, and we're excited to have both of them chatting about AI safety today. Kimberlee and Henry, thanks so much for being here today.
Great to be here.
Feeling is mutual.
Before we talk about solutions, perhaps we need to start with a very fundamental question. What do we mean by AI safety? And from there, start thinking about what sorts of things do we focus on when we frame conversations about AI regulation and policy through the safety lens. So it might be helpful to talk about the different communities that use the term AI safety and what they mean when they talk about it. And then we might talk about whether there are risks that this framing highlights or whether there are risks that this framing leaves out.
Yeah, hugely debated, right? There isn't general agreement on what counts as safety when we're talking about AI safety, right? And if you go back in some technical communities, safety is this narrow thing, right? It's kind of focused on technical risks, it's focused on the larger models and finding ways to address those risks, again, usually focused on kind of technical responses, things like red teaming or things like alignment and different ways of training the model. And you see this kind of scoping in things like the most recent version of the International AI Safety Report and the stuff that came out of processes like Bletchley Park, where countries got together to talk about these technical safety questions. Look, others, including most recently, for example, the UN, what do they call them? The Independent International Scientific Panel on AI, appointed by the UN. They talk about a much broader set of risks. So the ones we're experiencing now, the ones that sit at the frontier with the models, with the more advanced models. They talk about systemic risks and particularly societal disruption. So effects on employment, effects on the information environment, disinformation, impacts on democracy, environmental impacts of the training centres and the amount of compute and energy required to use these models. The other thing that came out of this UN report that was only released about a week and a half ago is a focus on the way that AI can accelerate concentrations of power and increase inequality. And then if you read the Pope, he'll talk about moral and spiritual effects. So, there's different people highlighting different issues when it comes to AI safety. There's people who would prefer to keep it as a technical term, and then because it's become the dominant language that you see in global processes, there's a lot of people who would say, well, you can't say AI is safe if it's destroying the planet. You can't say it's safe if it's massively impacting our information environment and our democracies. So, there's a broader picture that has to be taken into account. And look, if you'd asked me about this, say, about a year and a half ago, I would have said these two communities are really very divided and that there's almost active conflict between them. I think, and maybe I'm being naive, but I think things are shifting a little. What I'm hearing from the more technical communities now is they're also worried about the stuff around concentration of power, impacts on employment. We're seeing, the larger companies talking about that. So I think there's been a bit of a shift in the way that discourse is happening. But I'd be interested in what you think too, Henry.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Well, actually, that's a good cue because, yeah, I agree. There's definitely been this rapprochement, but, just to flesh out historically that conflict that you're describing, I think AI safety has historically been associated with a discourse of catastrophic and even existential risk, like really speculative situations of loss of control of AI being deceptive, as well as, then more recently, kind of the national security stuff, misuse of AI, a general purpose technology, lowering the barriers to entry to create weapons, cyber weapons, nuclear, biological, chemical, and so on. And the strong criticism of this framing that's been, especially from scholars in the humanities and social sciences, is that it tends to nudge the conversation towards speculative risks and to actively distract from, and in the worst case, in a cynical way, avoid the kind of accountability and transparency about the real risks that you were describing, as well as risks of discrimination, of surveillance, of hollowing out the value of services and kind of replacing them with mediocre automated versions for cost cutting in government, and so on and so forth. So people use the label "critty hype," right? Or sort of a duality between boosterism and doomerism. So I think that's all true, but I tend to agree with you, Kim, that this is where we are. This is where the conversation has gone. Safety is now the prevailing metaphor, but we can treat it as a metaphor rather than as a sort of a narrow definition. And, we can simultaneously be critical, as we are being now, and acknowledge the ways in which it could limit the conversation, the discourse, and distract us, and also push to where there actually is influence, kind of pragmatically. So where is there influence now? Well, the biggest conference on AI and automated decision-making harms in Australia is quite clearly the AI Safety Forum. It was cross-disciplinary. It was not purely technical. Again, all of the kind of regulatory process in Australia has moved away from focusing on fairness, transparency, and accountability towards this AI safety narrative. We have an AI Safety Institute. But again, I think from speaking to those people there and hearing what they have to say, they are interested in these broader dimensions of existing problems and existing harms. So there's something promising there. We can't always get what we want. We're sitting to some extent on the sidelines as academics, and we'd love to have a perfectly balanced conversation in the public conversation. It's not what we've got, so we've got to make do.
So it sounds like the discussion on safety has almost evolved from originally being this quite technical conversation that was influenced by the sort of long-termist kind of view into now more a kind of umbrella conversation within which we're dealing with those kinds of questions, but also more near-term kinds of questions, actual harms that are happening now, general questions about the political economy of AI and concentrations of power, and the fact that we have these giant companies, giant firms that have more capital and power than any firms that have existed in history. And that's all now being, it sounds like, explored through this lens of AI safety. I suppose that creates a politics of safety, a politics of determining what matters when we talk about safety, which sounds like is emerging as a new terrain in the discussion about AI policy as well. So I wonder then, what are some of the sort of harms and risks associated with AI that are already affecting Australians that might fall under this umbrella of AI safety?
Yeah, so there are a lot of harms and risks, and it also depends on how you define AI. So if we imagine that AI is only, for example, large language models, then there's a particular set of risks associated with that. But if we assume that AI is essentially the involvement of kind of automated systems in all kinds of decision making, including decisions, prediction and creation of content, then, it's a very wide range of risks. So, in Australia, our biggest and most scandalous encounter with what could be described as a very sort of simple data-driven system, which might fall under that category, is robo-debt, right? So we had hundreds of thousands of Australians being wrongly accused of being overpaid welfare with disastrous consequences. And it wasn't that, that's a perfect example. The technological testing there was obviously lacking, but it was the fundamental lack of compassion and care in just implementing the system as a whole. That just every aspect of how the government went about designing and deploying that system just lacked care and compassion and thoughtfulness, right? And that resulted in real harm to real people. More recently, we've had privacy cases about real-time biometric identification, constant surveillance in retail settings. And while the Privacy Commissioner did try to kind of curtail that on appeal, that outcome was very limited, and it seems it opens the door to that kind of, biometric ID, which is to say using AI to recognize you. As long as you delete your data, at the time and use it in a temporary way, it seems like we're okay, or at least our legal system is currently okay with everyone being surveilled and treated as a suspect at all times in a retail setting, which seems to me, horrifying.
Just for our listeners, can we confirm that we're talking about Bunnings right now?
We're talking about the Bunnings case here. So we're talking about a situation where Bunnings was deploying, justified by concerns about shoplifting and also violence and harassment towards staff, was deploying real-time face recognition to sort of detect, people who were threats or at risk of being a problem in the store quickly, and then to call in law enforcement, call police. But was applying that universally to everyone. So anyone who went into a Bunnings store was being treated in this way. And, it was found to be a sort of a disproportionate response to the risk. But, we won't go into the details, but basically it was rather narrowly decided, and does seem to suggest that if you can kind of make it a strong enough argument about, exactly what is going to be proportionate and be really clear about the risks that you're concerned about, then it seems rather easy to justify using it according to that logic. So that's very disturbing. And it reveals this gap, which is that we're relying on privacy law, which is about kind of collection and storage of information to protect people from surveillance, right? Which is a different issue, just being subjected to automated and constant surveillance and suspicion, and changing your relationship with the government, with private entities in public spaces, to one of suspicion and surveillance rather than of kind of mutual respect. So that's, an interesting example. Is that safety? It certainly doesn't make me feel great. It doesn't make me feel great when I go into Woolworths and I see a surveillance camera looking into my trolley at my personal belongings that are also in my trolley and detecting all of them and profiling me. So that's rather a good illustration of the nature of the problem.
Beyond these sorts of automated decision-making systems and privacy intrusive systems like biometric surveillance, what about some of the newer safety risks we're seeing that are associated with LLMs and generative AI, for instance?
Yeah, there's the ones that people are probably most familiar with would be things like the ability to generate convincing but completely untrue video and pictures and images of people. So, the deep fakes. Australians are already experiencing cases of people cloning voices. There's been a lot of controversy around apps that are used to nudify people and otherwise generate kind of harassing material, misogynist material, discriminatory material. So that's associated with the big models and is generating very real harms right now. Australians are victims of all kinds of scams and lose a lot of money to scams right now. Some of that is being hypercharged by the capacities of these technologies. Another thing that has come up most immediately with the bigger models very recently, of course, is the cybersecurity issue. capacities, particularly of some of the more advanced models to detect weaknesses in systems, to like iterate constantly until they find some sort of weakness in a system, has certainly caused a lot of concern amongst law enforcement and the national security agencies. The Five Eyes issued a warning basically saying this is now something that has to be reviewed by companies constantly. Of course, culminating in things like the withdrawal of the Fable model for a while, mostly around real or confected cybersecurity concerns. So that's another thing that really has emerged from the more recent models. I mean, another thing that people are talking about a great deal, and I'm sure Henry would have a view on this as well, is the way that people are using chatbots and the way that some of the chatbots might be bringing on, really difficult mental health situations for people, when they spend too much time chatting to these models that either, affirm all of their illusions or take them down into very dark places. That's another harm that is emerging much more strongly from the more recent forms of the technology. And this is before we even get into all of the questions around the environmental impacts and the, immediate physical impacts, for example, of data centers that people are very much starting to raise now. So, there's a is that an AI safety question? It's not immediately obvious that the environmental questions are are easily counted within a kind of concept of safety. Although, as I said, earlier, it's really hard to say that AI is safe if it is destroying the planet or destroying the living environment for people. So, this takes us back to this problem of like what actually counts as safety. But there's a whole range of harms of the information environment, scams and financial harms, the surveillance harms that Henry has talked about that people are experiencing, right now in Australia.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kim, and thanks for highlighting this sort of growing relationship between discussions about safety and discussions about national security and securitization and the role that governments are increasingly taking on vis-a-vis forms of regulation of private firms through mechanisms like export controls and transparency and visibility, and asking for sort of pre-release information to ensure that there aren't too many unpredictable effects from models. And of course, thinking about those impacts on a global stage where countries have to interpret the actions of other governments in a particular way. And if a particular government is taking a certain action, that raises suspicion about the role of these models in military and other applications as well, and how that's all sort of collapsing into this discussion around safety. And I'm also very interested to perhaps hear more about Henry's work in particular on psychological risks through the use of chatbots, because it seems that this is such a present and real and tangible safety impact from this consumer technology, really.
Thanks, Jake. Well, yeah, that's been a really interesting line of work that I've kind of started pursuing. I initially used chatbots as a case study, looking at responsibility for harms, and then started just becoming more interested in the specific application myself. And Jeannie Patterson, who we also know is a law academic at Uni of Melbourne, has done great work on chatbots too. Yeah, I think in terms of regulatory response, chatbots have been a sort of an outlier. There's been, governments have been quite slow to regulate, but because the harms from chatbots and the instances and the news stories of young people taking their own lives while being egged on by a sycophantic chatbot, or people being kind of encouraged into delusional states, they're so vivid and they're so horrifying that there has been a regulatory response. But the response has been very much focused on very particular, narrowly conceived harms. It's or really about content. It's really been about content control. So in Australia, we have our e-safety regime, and that applies to chatbots. And but because of the remit of that regulator, it's about harmful content. It's very much about age-gating, risky chatbots that might produce harmful content, or implementing risk management around the content. But, consistent with the theme of our discussion today, I think that is all important. That's great. It's good that we're doing it. It's good that if a user of a chatbot says something about suicide, that there are measures in place to direct that person to safer, more constructive relationships with real people, or even just better AI models. That's all great. But it's a narrow focus. And actually the issue is, very concentrated control over a whole kind of edifice of digital intimacy and dependency, and a lot of power over people through intimacy, a power over intimacy and power through intimacy. And so I'm interested in, it's the theme, I think, for a lot of questions about regulation of AI is, how do we regulate fundamentally this asymmetry of power? How do you respond to that asymmetry of power, from which all of the other risks or harms kind of flow? And also from which, just as a matter of kind of our intuitions, responsibility, ought to arise. If someone is in a position of great power in relation to somebody else who is very dependent and very vulnerable. I mean, we're all vulnerable. I don't use the term disparagingly. We're all vulnerable in different circumstances. But, in that particular relationship, we've got multi-billion or trillion-dollar companies, the most powerful entities in the world, among the most powerful. And then we have individuals who are vulnerable or lonely in some circumstances, or not vulnerable or lonely, but just become dependent on these technologies. That is reason to try to think about how to manage these huge discrepancies of power with law and governance and every other tool at our disposal.
Thanks so much, Henry. And I suppose that is a good opportunity to start talking about what Australia is doing about AI safety now at this time. I note that Kimberlee and Henry, you were both recently involved in an event at the University of Sydney that focused on AI safety in Australia. And it sounds like there were lots of discussions there about the Australian government's new AI Safety Institute, which recently launched. Perhaps we could talk about the tasks, the role that AI Safety Institute has, and then maybe we can talk about whether we think that this is an adequate national approach to dealing with AI safety.
Sure, Jake. Well, I'll just say, I just want to kind of contextualize it a little bit in terms of the evolution of what we've been talking about in terms of AI regulation in Australia. So in some ways, it's disappointing. We had this long consultation process where it was very involved and where the government sort of acknowledged there are serious limits in our regulatory frameworks in terms of dealing with AI harms. They appointed an expert group. They got advice from the expert group. They promised us mandatory guardrails or proposed mandatory guardrails to deal with high-risk applications of AI where it was making important decisions or involved in high-risk contexts. And that would have sort of gone some way to harmonizing our approach to regulation with the leading approach, which is in Europe. And, it wouldn't have been perfect, but it would have been a sort of a baseline of regulating existing problems. And instead it's been replaced with, a relatively poorly funded AI Safety Institute that doesn't seem to have enforcement powers, that has kind of testing and advisory remit, right? So on the one hand, that's disappointing, but as I said, that's what we have. And I think it's now we have to think about how best to make use of that remit in order to forge ahead in actually promoting responsible and fair development and deployment of these kinds of systems.
Could we talk a little bit about what the AI Safety Institute's job actually is? Just so everyone gets a sense of the scope of their power and activities.
Yeah, so Andrew Charlton actually talked about this at the forum, and he outlined basically 3 tasks. So the first is analysing and testing frontier models, particularly, the big ones, particularly working with the bigger companies and working with equivalent safety institutes like the UK one to, red team test, do the cybersecurity testing. So that's a really sort of technical scientific role, and contributing to that, what you might see as a global effort between a range of safety institutes that have been established by a whole range of countries. The second is supporting government regulators. So, Henry's right, this thing doesn't have enforcement powers, but it is supposed to support our existing regulators, so whether that's the ACCC or ASIC or environmental regulators, workplace regulators, to respond to whatever emerging AI capabilities or risks or harms are there. So it's kind of like access to a bunch of experts, technical experts and policy experts for those regulators, and perhaps to give them early warning of what's coming down the line. And the third is that kind of, I guess, AI development policy and international governance. So it's like an internationally facing role, playing a role as Australia contributes to, things like the UN Global Dialogue or the successors to the Bletchley Park process. What's striking about a lot of this is a couple of things. One is that it has been set up within government. So it is entirely within the Department of Industry. It is not an independent body. And in some ways, I think that's potentially problematic from the perspective of, access to what it's saying, whether it's going to be quite as independent in what it publishes and what it says to the Australian public, I guess is a bit of a wait and see. But, setting it up within government, I think, is something potentially compromises our ability to know exactly what's going on. And I mean, the second thing is, as we said, it's been set up within the Department of Industry. It's supposed to advise a whole group of regulators right across different departments, and how that really works is going to be an interesting question. I mean, it has no power to force its views or force regulators to change their priorities. It is a purely advisory role. And if I could just follow up a little, I think that's one of the interest. It's interesting to contextualise that with the Prime Minister's speech that he gave this week. Right? Up till now, Australia has been operating, after we decided we weren't going to do the mandatory guardrails, we've been operating under this thing called the National AI Plan, which more or less said we're going to let, all the different parts of government kind of do their thing in response to what's going on in AI. And that has led to an extremely fragmented approach, different levels of expertise across different parts of government, different levels of interest across different parts of government, and not always obviously coordinated or with any kind of strategy behind it. The Prime Minister came out this week in mid-July and gave a speech where he's said he's sort of pivoted that a little. So he said, actually, we're going to put a bit more coordination and focus around this. I'm going to set up an Office for AI within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which will mean that actually things hopefully will be a little bit more coordinated and perhaps have the force of the Prime Minister's interest and focus behind it. Now, that still leaves the AI Safety Institute sitting in the Department of Industry doing its scientific thing and advising regulators, but at least there is perhaps a bit more of a central focus to it now. And by the way, I completely agree with Henry that it is woefully underfunded for, if it's trying to do, the kind of leading cutting edge scientific stuff, but also address more general harms, as Andrew Charlton certainly suggested in his speech. That's a very big remit, and there is not a lot of funding behind that, particularly once you put the sort of little bit of science safety funding in Australia beside the masses of funding going into building and developing these models.
So it sounds like Australia maybe, and this is speculating of course, is setting up an arrangement where the sort of AI safety discussion is more about some of these technical matters in particular, and the Office for AI that was announced this week, in the context of a speech called AI in Australian Interests, is more about some of the broader economic considerations about AI deployment and training, political economy, for instance, where it'll be very interesting to see how these regulatory, if we can call them that, regulatory entities interact in the scope of AI policy in Australia. But I suppose the question would be then, if we had an AI Safety Institute that we didn't consider underfunded, for instance, then what do we think it could be doing? What would we hope that our officers, our entities, agencies that exist now to protect us from the various gamut of harms associated with AI, from some of these, more speculative existential threats through to the, psychological risks associated with using chatbots? What do we hope that some of these entities could be doing? What could their role be in the AI safety conversation? What are Australia's strengths in AI safety, and how can we be deploying them?
Thanks, Jake. I think there are two questions there that we can unpack. And one is sort of what could, if we had something like a regulator or a body that was devoted to, AI risks, harms, wrongs, and so on in Australia, what might that agency do and do well? And then the other is what in Australia, in terms of this broader conversation about shaping the future of governance of AI more generally, including these, more frontier risks, but also the existing risks, consistent with what is imagined right now. So in terms of what we can do in Australia, I think that there are some really important basic problems. One is people who are subject to decisions or impacts from AI very often just don't even know about it. Or if they know about it, there's no way to complain about it. There's no aggregation of information, and the information is not going throughout a whole life cycle and system of accountability. The dots are just not joined, right? So playing that role, providing a place to complain, doing some oversight and creating awareness of where AI and automated decision making is being used, and making that available to the public, and then connecting them with, kind of avenues for contestability and accountability and remediating wrongs. If we're going to rely on our existing laws, as is the plan, actually connecting people with the mechanisms to do that. I think that would be an admirable goal or an aspiration for an agency like this, domestically. Internationally, at the AI Safety Forum at the Sydney Uni that we went to last week, which Kim played a big role in bringing all those people together, there were a bunch of very interesting talks about this. What is Australia's role as a so-called middle power? What's our comparative advantage in this big ecosystem of governance and accountability? And there was a researcher called Anton Leicht who was saying, well, building data centers kind of gets a bad name because of all of the environmental damage and the cost of power and so on associated with that. But actually, and this is rather consistent with what the Prime Minister was saying this week, in Australia, we have a lot of space, we have a lot of renewable energy, and geographically, we actually have some advantages in our capacity to build data centers. And if we have something that these AI companies want, and also the states who are backing them want, right, which is the computational power, then we have leverage to engage in a global discussion about governance. I think it's an interesting idea. I actually don't have a firm opinion about whether I agree with it or whether I disagree with it, but I think it's an interesting idea. And it does seem there are sort of some hints of that in what the Prime Minister was saying this week. Then there's this other avenue, and this is people from the Tech Policy Institute have been pushing this line, which is Australia has a role here as a convener of cooperation among a group of countries. That we're a trusted country. We have a good reputation internationally. Much like Canada has been leading in this way in promoting, various, alternatives to unipolar or bipolar power, and that we could cooperate with other powers in order to push a governance agenda. I think both of those things are really interesting ideas.
Thanks, Henry. So really, Australia moving towards being more of a rule setter rather than a rule taker when it comes to some of these AI safety questions.
Or taking a new approach to rule setting, which recognizes that cooperation and collaboration is going to be a key part. If we want to be a rule setter, we have to actually build the relationships that would allow us to do that.
Yeah, and I would add to that by saying a couple of things. One is that one of the things that I said in a slightly Pollyanna-ish kind of way in the talk I gave at the AI Safety Forum was that actually you could see this as potentially a bit of a moment where there's an opening for this. It's very clear that in countries around the world, concern and fear of the impacts of AI are growing. Right? This is an issue for governments that if they simply allow the ongoing concentration of power, the ongoing concentration of resources, the unequal distribution of negative impacts, willy-nilly data centres, etc., that's actually not in anyone's interests, and it's probably not even in the interests of the biggest companies. It is certainly not in the interests of the biggest companies that they are subject to the whims of one particular president and not subject to, a more predictable set of rules about what is or isn't allowed. So if you wanted to make the case that there was a time and a place where Australia ought to and should step up and actually do some of this convening, start being more of a rule maker in coordination with a range of other countries that are thinking the same sorts of things, then this would be a good time to do it. I suppose the other, you asked earlier, Jake, about what Australia's strengths in this space are, and as Henry has pointed out, Johanna Weaver and the Tech Policy Design Institute people have been pushing this line that actually we have a whole lot of areas we're strong in. One area we do have some strength in is actually we do have a bunch of AI safety type researchers, including people who are thinking about not just some of the established lines in the science around, alignment of models, etc., but who are thinking about things like how do you monitor the systems when they're running, which of course is the really critical question, right? It's not because you can't test and fix everything pre-deployment stage. Maybe you'd like to, maybe we should try. But another critical part of any kind of, is this going to operate safely, is working out what is going on so you can intervene as things go on. And that has not been an area where there's been a whole lot of investment or we have found the solution to all of the problems. So, maybe we can also contribute to that. Henry's already mentioned that privacy law reform is well overdue, but another big one is the digital duty of care. This idea that entities that are, the platforms are the obvious one, but, entities that are doing online services should have to proactively identify risks arising from their systems and take steps to address those risks. Maybe even, as we have outlined would be preferable in a policy brief, actually have some outcomes around the interests of their customers and users and providing safe environments for those customers and users. So I think it would be, if the government is serious about keeping Australians safe, then it actually needs to create the incentives to make sure that, companies have some reason to take steps to protect Australians from harms, and I think the digital duty of care would be one way to do that.
Kimberlee and Henry, thank you so much for joining us today.
What a pleasure. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast from the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. For information on the centre, go to admscentre.org.au.